Good afternoon, and many thanks to all of you for joining us. My name is Alfonso Iorio. I'm the chair of the Department of Health, Research Method, Evidence and Impact, proudly hosting the 2022 Hooker Distinguished Visiting Professor Lecture Series. And before I continue, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the members of this year organizing committee for their commitment and tireless effort in planning this year virtual iteration of the lecture. So the Hooker Distinguished Visiting Professor Lecture Series was made possible by the very generous bequest from the estate of its namesake, Dr. Harry Hyman Hooker. Dr. Hooker was a dedicated physician, a true scholar, and a compassionate man. He grew up in Hamilton before moving to New York City, where he would spend his career practicing internal medicine. Each year, the Faculty of Health Sciences at McMaster University honored Dr. Hooker while exposing our community to a scholar whose work will stimulate and enhance approaches to answer one or more of the central questions that lie at the heart of McMaster mission. Within this spirit, we could not be more pleased to host and introduce you to Dr. David Allison, Dean and Distinguished Professor at Indiana University's Bloomington School of Public Health. Dr. Allison is worthy known before any content consideration for his rigor in research methods and uncompromising truthful communication of research findings. With more than 600 scientific papers published, he's a leading thinker and researcher in the areas of nutrition, including clinical trials, statistical and research methodology, and research rigor and integrity. Throughout his distinguished career, he has received several top honors, including the Presidential Award for Excellence in Mathematics and Science Mentoring in 2006, and in 2009, he was elected as a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Throughout this afternoon lecture, Dr. Allison will be exploring the need and opportunities for greater rigor in science, using obesity and nutrition as the exemplar. Following his lecture, we will dedicate approximately 10 minutes to questions. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. David Allison, the 2022 Hooker Distinguished Visiting Professor. David, floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I see many familiar names and faces, and I'd especially like to thank you for the great honor of being selected as the Hooker Lecturer for this year. It truly is an honor. Dr. Hooker and I have several things in common, including both being from New York originally, and both being interested in promoting benefits to others through science and education. So let me see if I can share my screen. Give me just a moment here.
Okay.
Nope, that doesn't look right. Sorry about that. There we go. You should be seeing my screen with the slides now, and I will switch to presentation mode. And please, Dr. Lorio, please let me know if that looks correct.
Perfect. Good to go.
Good. Thank you. So, as the title slide indicates, we're going to explore the need and opportunities for greater rigor in science in general, but I'm going to use nutrition and obesity research, which is the domain in which I work, as the exemplar for this. I'm not going to read this slide to you. It gives my disclosures and some acknowledgements, but importantly at the bottom is my email address. If any of you want the slides, just drop me an email and I'll be glad to send them to you. And then you can read the disclosure yourself if you wish. All right, so why is it important to get the science and research right? I mean, I've actually had people say to me, does it really matter that much? And we'll talk about that a little bit. And I think the answer is it does matter that much. But then also we'll talk a little bit about ways science goes wrong with some examples, maybe have a little fun in there. And then we'll talk about really what can we do? Let's switch back to being constructive And what can we all do to make science better? Well, why do we do science? Science is the best method to come to objective knowledge about the world. Science comes from the Latin scientia, meaning to have knowledge. And why do we do this? Well, we want to come to knowledge itself, its own value. We want to learn. Second is it's the beauty of science. It's the beauty of wondering, the beauty of discovery. And each of us appreciates that differently. For me, one of the most beautiful things in science I've seen is the Euler equation. And when you see Euler's equation pop out of thinking about I, the imaginary number, and thinking about cosines and the unit circle, to me, it's truly amazing and beautiful. But it's only makes sense as beautiful if we get it right. The knowledge is only knowledge if we get it right. So if we do science for knowledge or beauty, then we need to get it right. And then even at a most practical level, it's to predict and control aspects of our environment. We want to predict whether or not, and control whether or not that plane is going to land safely. We want to predict and control whether or not those vaccines are going to be safe and effective for us. We want to predict and control whether the antibiotics work, whether the seatbelts work, whether the car airbags work, whether the educational program works, and so on. We need to know whether these things work. And lives are at stake, and livelihoods. When we deal with forensic science, individual life and liberty are at stake. It is important to get it right. And so it's vital that we do science well. Now, many people in science will often glibly talk about the scientific method and say, well, I practice the scientific method. And in sort of little textbooky kinds of things, that's fine. But when you really start to dig in, you realize there's no such thing as the scientific method. There's no single thing where we say, aha, that's the scientific method. And it's one way of this hypothetico-deductive loop just doesn't exist. But there is an approach to coming to knowledge that involves a commitment to empirical evidence, to not engaging in supernatural explanations, and to updating one's belief in response to evidence, trying to be objective about it. And that's really what Lee McIntyre called the scientific attitude. And I think that's what it comes down to. And these are a number of books which I highly recommend for thinking about how we do science well. And what it really comes down to is being open to evidence and adjusting one's idea with the most rigorous and objective pursuit and evaluation of evidence possible. We have a book about this ourselves. It's a kind of a light book, but it's used to engage our partners in the School of Public Health with notions of public health as a science. And if anybody wants a copy of this book, which is called It's About Knowing, just drop me an email and we'll send you a free copy of the book. And we say that that's our tagline, it's about knowing, because conjecture is good, but knowing is better. And here's an example of this. This is a paper by some friends of mine and some former mentorees and colleagues at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where I used to work. And they led a study in which they looked at metformin for promotion of muscle hypertrophy in response to resistance training among older adults. And the thought was that metformin, which reduced inflammation, would actually lead to more hypertrophy. That is, if you're an older adult and you exercised while taking metformin, you would do better than if you exercised while not taking metformin. And it turned out the exact opposite was true. And you can see that quotation at the bottom. Metformin negatively impacts the hypertrophic response to resistance training in healthy older adults. So the exact opposite of what very intelligent, very well-educated, very well-informed people thought about this topic is what turned out to be true. And this shows why it is so vital to, as John Hunter very famously said to the inventor of the vaccines, Edward Jenner, his mentoree, why think? Do the experiment. If we want to know the answer, we've got to do the experiment, because conjecture is good, but knowing is better.
The title of the webinar here, this is less more of an editorial shot, but it's kind of...
Maybe Wayne and Trish can turn their microphone. Thank you. Now, Some people will talk about a crisis of a reproducibility or a rigor or a replicability crisis. And the question is there a crisis? And I've been part of a group, or I was part of a group at the National Academy of Sciences, in which we had a reproducibility and replicability panel. And we produced a report, which is pictured up here on the right. It was the most downloaded report of 2019. You may download it freely. There's no charge. Just go to the National Academy website. You can download the entire PDF, and I encourage you to do so. I'm obviously biased, but I think there's a lot of good stuff in it. And in it, we say, there's no evidence for a crisis, but there's also no room for complacency. Well, that's what the report says. My own opinion is that the word crisis can have different meanings. One common meaning is that it's a functional system facing imminent collapse. If you believe that that's what crisis means, then I think there's no reproducibility crisis or replicability crisis in science. There's no sense that science is about to collapse and stop working. Another way of looking at crisis is things are getting much worse, and they are much worse than they used to be. And I think there's absolutely no evidence that on average that's the case. My own sense is that science is probably more rigorous today than it has ever been. We have clinical trials registries, we have raw data depositing, not universally used, but more and more used. We have pre-registration of studies. We have consort and Miami guidelines for reporting and so forth. But there's a third way of thinking about crisis. And that's when social attitudes change to a point where there is a recognition that the problems are not trivial and are no longer acceptable. And you think about various social movements like civil rights movements as an example, which often occur not when things have gotten worse for an oppressed group, often after things have gotten better and the oppressed group starts to have a voice. And the oppressed group says, yes, things may have gotten better, but you know what? We have a long way to go. And the current situation is not good enough, and it is not acceptable. Think of 1960s civil rights in the United States. Clearly, nobody could have looked at that and said things were worse in the 1960s than they were in the 1860s or the 1760s. Clearly, things were better. And yet, at the same time, there was this moment when, as a national community, we came together and said, there is a crisis. Things are no longer acceptable. And I think that's where we are with science, where we say, science is probably better and more rigorous than it's ever been before. Every problem you can show me in science, I believe I can show you a problem where that was a problem in science 50 or more years ago. But I think there's a sense now that says we now recognize these problems and we need to do better. We need to up our game. And in that sense, maybe there is a crisis. All right, so what are some of these problems? How does science sometimes go wrong? Let's put some of these things in and show some examples. I'm going to go through this very quickly, otherwise it would take me an hour just to go through this slide alone. But this is an interesting, to me at least, historic set of some of the many problems that we still have in science and show that they go back a long time. One is fabrication and falsification. It seems pretty clear at this point that Brother Gregor Mendel fudged his data. By today's standards, he'd almost assuredly be convicted of scientific misconduct for falsification or fabrication of data. And this was shown by no less a figure than Sir Ronald Fisher, the great statistician, who showed that Gregor Mendel's Punnett squares were too close to the expected frequencies to have occurred by chance. His identification of the number of unlinked loci in different circumstances in the pea plant were he found too many to have found by chance, given the size of the pea genome. It's very clear that Pasteur engaged in selective publication, what we call selective publication today, or publication bias, in which he put out some of the results that supported his beliefs, but not all of his results. It's very clear that Eddington did a little better, but Lord Eddington also dropped some data in looking at some measurements that confirmed Einstein's theory of special relativity. And after Eddington looked at the eclipse data and showed that light bent toward the sun, he was given an interview by a reporter And the reporter said, Einstein was given an interview by a reporter. And the reporter said to Einstein, Professor Einstein, how would you have felt if Lord Eddington had not confirmed your results? And Einstein said, I would have felt very bad for the good Lord, because it would have meant that the experiment was wrong. So Einstein was very confident that he had the right answer. And Eddington, in order to get, quote unquote, the right answer, needed to drop an outlier, the so-called Sobrel data. He dropped the outlier and he got the right answer. But if he hadn't dropped that outlier, his data would have been much more consistent with a Newtonian interpretation than an Einsteinian interpretation. Now, Eddington was clear and open and honest that he dropped that outlier, whereas Pasteur was not transparent in that he wasn't fully revealing everything. But that shows some of the challenges that we face. There are honest errors. Blanc, who discovered N rays. You may say, what are N rays? You've never heard of them? That's because they don't exist. N is for the town of Nancy, where Blanc did his work. And Robert Wood, a physicist from Hopkins, went over there. And the rays were detected by a calcium sulfide thread that glowed slightly in the dark when the rays were refracted through a 60-degree angle prism of aluminum. And at one point, Robert Wood reached into the device, palmed the prism, then asked Blanc to show him the N rays again. Blanc did, said, you see, Professor, they're working. And then Robert Wood said, look, I'm holding your prism in my hand. How could it be working? And that was the end of N rays. That seemed to be an honest error. Linus Pauling thought DNA was a triple helix, not a double helix, because he did not get to go to the United Kingdom and see Rosalind Franklin's good X-ray crystallography data, because the US government had taken away his passport because he was an anti-nuclear warhead protester, and they felt he was a communist. Because of that, they took away his passport, and he made an honest error. There's the use of substandard methods, such as when people had bad sampling and thought that normal thymus glands were actually enlarged thymus glands, and on the basis of that, irradiated the healthy thymus glands of many children, and thereby caused thyroid cancer. Thyroid is near the thymus in many normal healthy children due to bad epidemiologic sampling that anybody, even at that time, would have known was bad epidemiologic sampling. And then finally, we come to modern nutrition, and we just have sloppy, weak methods. So they're not so corrupt science, but it's weak science. And it's weak science that, as a field, we perhaps have not fully embraced getting over. It's the excessive use of observational as opposed to interventional or randomized studies, and the excessive use of poor measurement tools. This leads in many cases to myths and presumptions about obesity and nutrition above and beyond facts. We published a paper on this in the New England Journal of Medicine some years ago. And here's a look at our paper, in which we showed that there are many, many common beliefs in the field of nutrition and obesity for which either there's really no strong evidence, we call that a presumption, or there's actually evidence to the contrary, and we call that a myth. So I urge you to go back, look at those myths. I think you may be amused by some of them. You may find that some of them are things you believe or believed, and yet you say, really, there's really no evidence for that, hey? I would encourage you to take a look at it. It's sort of eye-opening, not for just the specific myths we cover, but it's eye-opening in the sense of saying, wow, I never stopped to ask about that. I just accept it was true because everybody said it was true. Now, I want to point out in a little bit, I'm going to talk about some errors, and I'm going to make a little fun of some other mistakes that have occurred in the literature. But I want to be clear that error is human. We all know that we all make mistakes, and that includes me. And so while I'm going to make some fun of other people's mistakes, I want to point out my own mistakes. And some colleagues and I published a paper some years ago. And after publishing the paper involving self-report error corrections in obesity, somebody contacted us and they said, you know, we're looking at your raw data because it's publicly available. It was the NHANES data, and we can't reproduce your results. Oh no, this is the call you never want to get. But we took it seriously. We said, okay, let's pull up our raw data. Let's pull up the code. We sent our code to the people who wrote to us. We said to them, you send us your code. They sent us their code. We worked collegial and we realized we had both made mistakes. And we published a correction together, which you can see here, in which we fixed both of the mistakes. And you know what? We got an extra publication out of it. There were no recriminations. Nobody's career was hurt. Nobody was accused of anything. And to me, this is the collegial, expeditious way to work. Errors should be corrected, and they should be done quickly. And importantly, this was made possible because the raw data were publicly available. If our raw data were not publicly available, the other investigators probably would have never known we made a mistake, and vice versa. Okay, let's get into some design and method errors. Here's one, which is failure to take measurement as seriously as we do in other domains. Think about some of the work going on in physics and the super colliders and so on used to detect particles and the precision of estimation used. Think about telescopes and the precision of measurement used. And then think about the fact that in so much of obesity research, we still not only rely on BMI, which I know many people question. I rely on BMI quite often, but it has its limits. But we even rely on self-reported height and weight, which we know has many errors and biases in it. And you really have to say, gosh, when people in physics are getting the level of precision to get at the Higgs boson and gravitational waves, we're still measuring height and weight with self-report in many national surveys, such as the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, which gives you these wonderful maps that I'm sure you've all seen ad nauseum. And these come from the CDC calling up people on the phone, roughly 100,000 people every year, and saying, what's your height and weight? And as you might guess, people are not all accurate in reporting their height and weight. Now, if they were all inaccurate in the same way and to the same extent, it probably wouldn't matter that much. But they're not. And so here is an interesting comparison that my friend George Howard, who started a study called Regards, helped pull together. And what you have on the right-hand column is the state ranking for states in which George had measured heights and weights of a statewide representative sample. And on the left, you have the NHANES data, which are, the BRFSS data, which are also state representative data, but based on self-report. So the difference is left is self-report, the right is measured. If all people in all states were equally dishonest about their heights and weights, or equally inaccurate is really the right way for me to say it, but it's more fun to say dishonest, then in fact, all these lines would be horizontal lines and the rankings wouldn't change. But they're not all horizontal lines, and you can see the rankings do change. Rankings in which the line goes up from left to right means that that state is quote unquote more honest on average than other states. Whereas rankings where they go down, it's the other, I'm sorry, rankings where they go down, they're sort of more honest. Rankings where they go up, they're less honest. So the state I came from before coming to Indiana is Alabama. And you can see that that number here is going down. So Alabama is a very more honest state, at least with respect to heights and weight reporting, whereas some others like Minnesota is a much less than average honest state. Now, you may say, what do state rankings of obesity levels matter? And they may not. But if we're going to talk about them, then let's get them right. If we're not going to, won't care about getting them right, let's just not talk about them. Randomization. There are many problems with randomization. One of the most extreme occurred in the PrediMed article, which you see pictured here. This was one of the most important studies in the field of nutrition, one of the few studies which was a randomized controlled trial and showing prevention, primary prevention of hard endpoints of disease, heart attacks, for example. And then this had to be retracted and could no longer be labeled an effect, had to be labeled an association, because the investigators had totally botched the randomization, in some cases randomizing entire villages or households rather than individuals. My colleague, Colby Vorland, along with a whole group of us and I, including Dr. Thebain, who's here on this call with us, published a paper on that recently that got a great deal of positive attention, talking about all the different ways people screw up the randomization. So those are some of the challenges there. Many randomized studies either are not randomized at all or are not properly randomized. But again, this goes back a long time. I won't go through the details of this, but that figure in the picture in the upper right-hand corner is no less a figure than the great student, that is William Seeley Gossett Jr. And Gossett went under the pseudonym Student. He was a very humble man. And he published an article taking apart the Lanarkshire milk experiment. Think we have big data now. Well, 20,000 school children who should have been randomized to raw pasteurized milk or control, but in fact were not properly randomized. And that probably ruined what was otherwise a very important large randomized controlled trial close to 100 years ago. Now there's different kinds of errors. One way to think about different errors is normative errors versus non-normative errors. And by normative errors, I mean mistakes made at the cutting edge. So just to go back a little bit, whoops. And here I talked about Linus Pauling, and I think that was a normative error. His paper has not been retracted, in which he said incorrectly that DNA had a triple helix. And many people, including me, think it shouldn't be retracted because he was working at the leading edge of science. And that's what he thought at the time. And that mistake was part of the process of scientific discovery. Now that's very different than this paper, which was not a normative error, in which was just sloppy sampling, because instead of randomly sampling children to somehow try to measure their thymus glands, they looked at cadavers of children. And cadavers are not random samples of children. Cadavers tend to be poor children. Poor children tend to be undernourished, and undernourished children tend to have smaller thymuses. So that was bad sampling. People should have known 100 years ago was bad sampling. So in essence, they should have known better. So not normative error, normative error. Now let's jump ahead back to where we were. So a normative error would be Galileo trying to figure out whether the speed of light is finite. After Galileo was under house arrest by the Pope, couldn't leave his house, he designed the study, experiment, you might say loosely. He couldn't go execute it himself, but he got two colleagues to do it. And they stood at opposite hilltops with timepieces that were synchronized. And they flashed lights at each other via lanterns and shutters. And they were trying to figure out, does light travel instantaneously or does it have a finite speed? They concluded incorrectly that it traveled instantaneously because they could not measure the speed of light. We now know that light does not travel instantaneously. It does have a finite speed, but its speed is so great that with this kind of technology, there's no way you're going to pick it up. So that was a normative error. They're working at the leading edge. They did the best they could with the technology they had. In contrast, this is a non-normative error by Horace Seacrest, who was a statistician, and in his book on statistics, back in the early part of the 20th century, he argued that companies that are great revert to mediocrity. They become mediocre over time. What he didn't realize is that's just regression to the mean. Harold Hoteling, as in Hoteling's t-test and all, later worked on this and showed that Seacrest was wrong. But Seacrest wouldn't accept it, and then Hoteling got very aggressive. Hoteling was a very polite man at first, and then got very aggressive when Seacrest refused to acknowledge the mistake. That was not a normative error. Seacrest, as a statistician at that time, should have known better. Galton and Pearson had already introduced the concepts of regression to the mean. And if you want to learn more about regression to the mean, and it still goes on and on, you can read this paper, Best But Oft Forgotten Practices, about that we wrote. Mathematical analysis of errors, or mathematical or analysis errors are also common.
Sorry.
Yes, so question? No? Okay. One of the interesting things in thinking about how to detect errors is the simple question that we should ask ourselves more often, which is, how would somebody know that? I was reading a paper today in which the authors made what I would call, or what the lawyers would call, an ipsa dixit statement. Ipsa dixit is Latin for roughly, he himself said it. In other words, it's true because I said it's true. I just make an assertion without evidence. And the person said, in evolutionary history, iron metabolism was conserved, or something along those lines, evolutionarily conserved. As though we should just believe this and think, well, what is the evidence for that? Were they there? How did they know? And to start to ask that, how would you know that this aspect of iron metabolism was evolutionarily conserved? You have to stop and think, what evidence could you bring to bear? You have to reconstruct the past, and it's not impossible through modern DNA technology and other techniques, but you really have to ask, would somebody really know? Here's an example where people didn't stop to ask. If you went back a few years ago and you looked on the web, you could find lots and lots of statements that a myth of a bout of sexual activity burns 100 to 300 kilocalories for each person involved. And then people would say, well, look, you can lose weight by having sex. Isn't that wonderful? And then just stop, take a step back from it and start to think about it. Say, how would you know this? Well, here's what you'd have to do to figure that out. You could bring people into a metabolic chamber in which you have oxygen analyzers and CO2 analyzers. And you could figure out how much oxygen the people in the chamber consume and how much CO2 they produce. And because Lavoisier taught us that respiration is combustion, from there you could figure out their energy expenditure. And they could have sex in the metabolic chamber, and then you'd know that. And then you say, well, wait a minute. First of all, who's going to volunteer for the study? Are they going to be a random sample? Am I going to have bad sampling like the people with the thymus glands? Second, even if I can get over that, now I know the energy expenditure for two people, not one person. How do I separate that out? You could randomly assign couples, set up a system of simultaneous equations, have couples have different sexes and different sex and different pairings, and then you realize that's not going to get through the IRB. So that probably didn't occur. Then you have a measurement issue. Maybe people know they're being watched and that affects things. Who's going to volunteer for this study? So all of that makes you believe that's not realistic. What's slightly more realistic is you could get intact couples and you could give them a rubber face mask to breathe into that collects all the oxygen and CO2 rather than put them in a chamber. Let them take the rubber face mask home and have sex. And then you might say, what, who wants to do that? Well, there's some people might actually like the rubber face mask during sex, but it is a selected group now. And it's actually been done though. And this was done. And here's the study in which it was done. Now this one, only the men wore the rubber face mask. So this is the energy expenditure of men, not women. And these were young married couples, so not necessarily representative. And I won't take you through all the numbers, but when you go through all the numbers, it turns out that the amount of energy expended is above and beyond what some would spend sitting still watching TV, is probably about 14 calories or so. And when you look at the duration of the activity here, we're talking, these are seconds, right? So I don't want to offend anybody's ego, but we're talking about an activity that takes place over a few minutes, not over 30 minutes to an hour. So these ideas of 100 to 300 calories burned is just absolute nonsense. And just stopping to ask the question, how would one know, would show that it's nonsense. All right. We need to also always just look and say, is it plausible? So here's a paper that came out in 2014, modeling potential effects of reduced calories in kids' meals with toy giveaways, like at a fast food restaurant. And these authors said, if you put in a policy that said a kid's meal with a toy giveaway can't have more than X calories, you'd save kids eating X minus Y calories or Y minus X calories, where Y is the number they can eat now. And good things will happen. You did these calculations. And they said, gee, it looks like over the course of a year, this would be about 2 pounds. And I thought, that seems ambitious to me, but maybe plausible, perhaps. Then I saw this part, and it says calculations from the model include children who are estimated to eat fast food 4 or more times a day. Now, right off the bat, you just stop, really? Are you really asserting to me that there are children, not in one day? I'm not saying nobody in one day could have eaten 4 fast food meals. Are you really asserting to me that there are children who day after day, week after week, eat 4 fast food meals every day? That just seems implausible. And then it says, and for those children, they would gain, or they would avert a weight gain of 27 pounds per year by us changing what's in a fast food meal. Really? 27 pounds for a growing child? Have you ever had a child? Have you ever seen a child? Have you ever been a kid? Are you kidding? It's just implausible. So I called up my friend Kevin Hall at the National Institutes of Health, who has the leading model for estimating changes in body weight with changes in energy intake or expenditure in children. And he did these calculations. And what you can see, again, I won't read you through all the numbers, the original investigators were off by about a factor of 9. Why? Because of this so-called 3,500 calorie rule, which basically says a pound of body weight or body fat in a human takes about an extra 3,500 calories to add on. And so if you have an extra, 132 calories a week and you multiply by 52, then you get to that 2 pounds. And here's where you're multiplying by more. What this doesn't take into account is the nonlinearities that any biologist or physicist would have told you must exist. As you get heavier, you have a bigger body. As you have a bigger body, it takes more energy to pump blood through that body, more energy to maintain that body, more energy to move that body through space. Eventually, your energy expenditure goes up and it meets your new energy level of intake. And that's why this is complete nonsense. But to the author's credit, when we pointed this out to them in a letter to the editor, they did the right thing. They retracted the paper. They said, we acknowledge that we're wrong, and they fixed it. Math is a wonderful thing. I'm not a mathematician, but I'm a mathophile. My dad was a math teacher and a math professor, had his PhD in math education, and he always believed that math was like the ketchup of life, that everything went better with math. And as a young kid, I resisted him because probably like most young sons, I resisted my father. But as an adult, I believe him. And I truly think that everything goes better with math. This is a wonderful book by Jordan Ellenberg. He's got another wonderful book out now called Shape. I recommend them both to you. This one is a fun, lighter read on the power of mathematical thinking to not make silly mistakes. And here's one where we use some mathematical thinking. A paper had come out on something called meridian massage, which showed that people who were only about 70 kilograms to begin with, these were adult Japanese people, lost close to 10% of their body weight over 8 weeks by getting massages. You just sort of scratch your head on this. Again, go back to, is it plausible? Anybody who's ever tried to lose 10% of their body weight, let alone in 8 weeks, can tell you how hard it is. We looked at this and we just said, is this plausible? In order to do this, you'd have to have a 1,300 kilocalorie day restriction, which is close to cutting your food intake in half for an average person that size. Is it plausible that these people on average cut their food intake in half and maintain that for 8 weeks just by getting a massage? And it didn't seem plausible to me. We noticed something. In the paper, the authors had reported the baseline height and the baseline weight and the baseline BMI in means and SDs. And then at the end had reported the change in weight and the change in BMI. Well, from the change in weight and the change in BMI, we know BMI is kilograms divided by the square of height in meters. And we can back calculate one from the other. Now, the mathematically astute among you will say, hold it, Dr. Allison. The ratio of means is not the mean of the ratios, to which I'll reply, you are absolutely correct. But in geometric means, that holds up. And there's a little formula that you can use to very closely approximate geometric means if you have the arithmetic means and the standard deviations, which we did. So we approximated it, and we showed that these adults would have had to have grown an average of 6.5 centimeters in height over 8 weeks for the BMI results reported to be true. We wrote a letter to the editor about this, said this seems implausible that adults gained 6.5 centimeters in height in 8 weeks. And the paper was corrected. The author said, we made a mistake. The BMI results and weight change is only half of what we reported. They never explained what the mistake was, but at least we got it corrected through some simple math. Another common mistake we see is people doing what we call a DINS error. DINS stands for difference in nominal significance. The idea is I run, for example, parallel groups, randomized controlled trial, and I say, in the control group, there was no significant reduction in weight. P equals 0.051. In the treatment group, there was a statistically significant reduction in weight. P equals 0.049. Not significant, significant. Aha, I've got a difference. I've got an effect. Every statistician who's in this meeting knows that's utter nonsense. If you want to see the math of why it's nonsense, you can look up these papers that are referenced. We were able to point that out in several, and we've pointed this out in numerous papers and gotten several of them retracted. Cluster randomized trials are one of my pet peeves, whereby we see these amazing mistakes. The degree to which, the frequency with which people incorrectly analyze their cluster randomized trials by not taking into account the clustering and the nesting and adjusting the degrees of freedom properly, and thereby grossly overestimate the statistical significance of their results, often making results that would otherwise be non-statistically significant look statistically significant, is extraordinary. Here's a very interesting case whereby in 2019, some colleagues of I noticed this paper had made this mistake. We pointed it out, and the authors, in response to us, said, you know what, the Allison team is right. This was a mistake. We admit it, we acknowledge it. And then later, interestingly, the same group published another paper in which they made the same mistake. Even after years earlier, they acknowledged that it was wrong. And this led one of my colleagues to say, the first time is a mistake, the second time is a decision. There are also errors in communication. One is not knowing when to stop, and this is the mere exposure effect. So if, for example, you tell somebody something that's not true, but you tell them enough times, they're more likely to believe it if they've been told a fewer number of times. Interestingly, you don't even have to have data or claim to have data or even complete a sentence for this to be true. So for example, Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, there's the cover of the book from the Nobel Prize winning economist, Daniel Kahneman. And he says, for example, people who were repeatedly exposed to the phrase, the body temperature of a chicken, were more likely to accept as true the statement that the body temperature of a chicken is 144 degrees Fahrenheit or any other arbitrary number than those who weren't exposed to that. And by the way, I can assure you the body temperature of a chicken is not 144 degrees Fahrenheit unless you cook it. What we've shown here is that epidemiology is often used in this way. This is a plot of a cumulative meta-analysis that my colleagues and I did of skipping versus eating breakfast every day and its association with obesity. And what you see in the black line are the point estimates of the odds ratio and the confidence limits. And you see that after the first or second study, you already know that this is statistically significant. The confidence limits keep narrowing, as they should with more data, but the estimate is not changing all that much. The red line is minus log p-value, and you can see that the p-value is on the order of about 10 to the minus 42, close to the inverse of the number of protons in the universe, or Eddington's number. There's Eddington again. Did we really need as a field to do so many observational epidemiologic studies to drive the p-value down to the inverse of the number of protons in the universe? Really? How about right back here at around the late 1990s saying, we kind of got it. It's associated. We got it. Stop. You know what we need now? Now we need to do just as John Hunter said to his mentoree, Edward Jenner, the inventor of the vaccine. Why think? Do the experiment. We need to do the randomized controlled trials. Several of us, including myself, have now done those randomized controlled trials. Guess what? Skipping breakfast doesn't make you gain weight. If anything, it seems to help people lose weight. So often we are devoting our journal pages, our time, our students' time, our resources, our poster sessions, our journal pages to research that increases belief instead of to research that increases knowledge. We point that out in this paper here. There are distortions in the mass media. Here's an example, some examples. Skipping breakfast to lose weight makes you fatter and far more likely to raid the vending machine. What's the study? It's a presentation of proceedings of MRI results of observations of how much subjects ate at lunch after skipping breakfast. There were no changes in body weight reported and no vending machines involved. Headline, diet soda leaves your gut unsatisfied, contributes to obesity. It says your gut, right? Presumably human. You must say, well, there must have been a randomized controlled trial of people who were given diet soda and not diet soda, and they measured gut satisfaction and then changes in obesity. And drinking diet soda caused obesity in these randomized controlled trials. Well, here's the actual study. It's assessment of metabolic responses to different carbohydrate loads of bacteria in vitro. No humans, no diet soda, and no obesity were studied. US farm subsidy policies contribute to worsening obesity trends. Study finds. There actually is no study. The paper is an author's commentary review on farm subsidies. Drinking 5 cups of coffee every day may lead to obesity. Study. Wrong amount of coffee could kill you. Now, I know we have a lot of academics on this call, and I know academics drink a lot of coffee, so you guys should be worried. Until you go to the study, you find this is a study of mice involving a substance found in coffee, but not coffee itself, which showed no significant effect on weight gain and reported 0 deaths. It's quite a stretch. There are many other statements here in which we see hype and spin that come out of academic studies. You can see some of them here. Much of this is often because we, as academics, inappropriately use causal language when describing observational research. And here's from a survey of some of the top journals we did about 10 years ago. I'm hoping there's a terrific PhD student on this call who says, I need a good dissertation topic, and calls me up and says, can I collaborate with you? Send me your protocol so I can redo this study now more than 10 years later and see if things got better. I bet they did get better, but it'd be fun to test it. Well, is this all the media? People say, you know, I can't control this, Dr. Allison. It's the newspapers say what they want, or my press office says what it wants. I can't control them. But in fact, what Yavshitz et al. Have shown very clearly is that the spin seems to start with us. That is, when an abstract of a peer-reviewed publication contains spin, The press release from the university almost always contains spin, and then the news report virtually always contains spin. In contrast, when the scientific paper or abstract did not contain spin, whoops, what happened here? There we go. The press release rarely does, and the newspaper really does. So we have met the enemy, and it is us. Now we need to wrap up soon, so I'm going to start going a little faster, and I'll simply say that we often have just sloppiness in language, and that's a concept. Another place where we need more rigor. One of the big debates in the field now is people say, is the energy balance model, which they put out to be delta energy stores, change in energy stores equals change in energy in minus change in energy out. Delta energy stores equals delta energy in minus delta energy out. That's the statement of the law of conservation. And they say, does that mean the causal direction better? Is it better to explain the causal direction flowing from you got fat or stored more energy because you took in more energy, or you took in more energy because you stored more energy? Which direction does it flow? And they talk about this as though it's meaningful. And I think it's as meaningful as when Neil deGrasse Tyson wisely points out that it is not meaningful to say at which temperature does the number 7 melt. It's a perfectly grammatically correct question. And if you were a little sleepy and somebody posed that question to you, you might start to get ready to answer it until you realize just because this person can pose a perfectly grammatically correct question does not mean it is a logically meaningful question. And similarly, saying delta energy in equals delta energy out minus delta energy stores, delta energy stores equals delta energy in minus delta energy out is a statement of equivalence. It is not a causal model. So to ask which direction does the causation flow makes as much sense of saying, if I make the legs of my right triangle bigger, does that make the hypotenuse bigger? Or is it that making the hypotenuse bigger makes the legs bigger? It's a nonsensical question. Making the legs bigger is the same as making the hypotenuse bigger. It is inherent in the definition of triangle and vice versa. There's no direction of causation. All right, what do we do going forward? We make raw data available so that we can find these errors and fix them. We maintain a culture of integrity, as Gottlieb Frege pointed out or illustrated when Lord Bertrand Russell sent him Russell's paradox, and it undermined Frege's book that was in press, being literally printed at the time. And Frege called his publisher and said, put an appendix in the book that points out this letter from Russell that raises questions about my set theory. We should do training, though there's unclear that training really, that intellectual training really helps. I don't have time to get into these things. These are things that actually suggest that more creative, bright, well-trained scientists are often better at finding ways to obfuscate and not be quite honest with data. We need to take professional statistical expertise seriously. And I underline that word professional. And here's a little joke David Norris reported. A neurosurgeon forms a statistical consulting department to inform them. I'm doing a study and I'd rather just do my own statistics, so I don't need your help. I just wonder if you can suggest a good statistics text. And the consulting statistician says, I'm so glad you called. I always wanted to do brain surgery. Can you suggest a good text on that? We would not suggest that just because I have a pocket knife, a bottle of hand sanitizer, some rubber gloves, and an anatomy book, I'm ready to do brain surgery. Why would we suggest that someone who took one master's level course in statistics and owns a statistics book and SPSS is ready to do statistics in professional science? We need checklists to see that we get things right, just as Atul Gawande has pointed out we do in surgery. We need redundancy and to check. This is from the Apollo, the right stuff, the Apollo 13 episode.
Okay, Houston, checkmate. I've completed these table conversions, but I need a double check of the arithmetic. Okay, you said so. Okay, the roll cow angle is -2. Stand by, we're checking it. All right. So here, good, Andy. So we'll go on those numbers. You're good. Lock it in, Fredo.
So that's that kind of double checking we need. In our research and my team, we no longer will send any manuscript out for publication until after the first analyst has analyzed the data. He or she turns over all raw data, all code, the complete manuscript to a second professional statistician, and it must be a professional statistician who then repeats the analysis and verifies every number and every figure and every table. And only then will we release the paper. And we think that's the kind of rigor we need. All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to start to wrap up at this point. And I will simply say that I think we need a lot more courage and determination in fixing errors. You can look at the slides yourself and get a sense of that. How can you help? Hold yourself to the highest standards of rigor in communicating science. Don't bend it, don't obfuscate, don't spin it, don't exaggerate it. Getting your name in the newspapers is not that important. Hold others, especially journal editors, who really seem to have a hard time maintaining standards and correcting errors, to the highest standards of rigor in communicating science. Support research if you're a funder, to the highest standards of rigor. Support the research that really answers the question. And finally, be an honest broker and demand that others be honest brokers in distinguishing between evidence for conclusions that we know something is true and evidence for actions and recommendations. We're all entitled to say we must act and make recommendations now on the best evidence we have. This is what I believe now, go. And distinguish that from, I know this to be true. That's a higher standard. And as Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, let us take this path through the woods. These are some of our woods and hiking trails and areas in Bloomington, Indiana. I invite you all to come visit us. We'd love to take you on a hike and talk about science and epistemology, and evidence and nutrition and obesity and statistics while on the trail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Allison. Fascinating presentation. We are close to the hour. I'll invite anyone who has any burning quick question to raise their hand or unmute themselves and ask. I don't want to miss the opportunity to tell you all that we have 2 more occasions to meet and ask David for any question that might have been triggered by this presentation. Tomorrow afternoon at 4 and Friday morning. Details are on the HEI website. Any question from the audience? Well, I may ask to comment on something that I think is quite evident, which is I'm not sure if we teach enough our trainees how important is not only the production of science, but the criticism of science that appears, and not just on old science, but on as a way of improving the progress of science. And I would think that is something we could do better. I see in the meantime, Sonia and Greg piling up for questions. So you may leave my question for later. Sonia, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Alfonso. Professor Allison, I'm wondering if you could comment on the PREDIMED trial and if you think the paper should have been republished, and what should we do with all the many, probably over 100 papers that trial has published before and after the retraction republication?
So what I might call the main paper, which is the one in New England Journal that I cited, that was retracted and it was republished. And I do think that was the right decision. I think it should have been retracted and I think it should have been republished. It was republished being described as no longer as a randomized trial and no longer in cause and effect terms. So I think that was right. In terms of all the other studies, I don't know what to do with those. I mean, I haven't given it a lot of thought. I think the scientific record must be corrected. And so anywhere where those appeared and they were described as randomized trials, some note needs to go in there at minimum that says this issue occurred. They're not truly randomized. In terms of, how else to deal with so many of those, I don't know, but I think at minimum there needs to be some notation.
Thank you both. Greg?
Yeah, great lecture, David. I had a comment about, in your concluding slides, you focused a lot on, how to, checks and balances and the reproducibility issues and how to not overhype research, which is obviously really important. But you didn't really mention, the publication process and the single-mindedness of many editors to publish, high impact papers and where they fit into the process and how, even when you're reviewing for these journals like Nature or Science, often the editors will overcome the peer review comments because they simply like the message of the paper and where that fits into this whole problem. To me, that seems to be a major crux of the problem, and getting at that would be an efficient way to deal with it.
I think you're half right. I think what you're pointing out, if I can take your comment up a level of abstraction to say the problem is what some call the perverse incentives. That is, we incentivize exciting results, winning the game, getting the publication out there, and so on. And that leads to people who want to earn those rewards to potentially game the system, to distort, to bend, and in some cases to out and out lie. That's to me the same as saying, in baseball, we incentivize people hitting home runs. And that leads some people to take performance-enhancing steroids, and that's cheating. And I agree. And if we said we don't want people to do that, what we would not say, and have not said, is therefore we will stop rewarding people for hitting home runs or in races for running across the finish line first, because that would vitiate the whole idea of what baseball is and what a running race is. We want exciting findings in science. And I don't think we need fewer perverse incentives. I think we need more perverse incentives because we need people to go for the home runs. We need people to swing for the fences. It's hard. We need people to run fast at the finish line. But we also need the mitigating factors. So rather than getting rid of that, we need to say, but if your results aren't that exciting, you can still publish in F1000, PLOS, Frontiers, BMC, etc. And we're going to watch that you don't cheat when you try to get into Science and Nature and the tournament journals. But it's important to have the big prizes. So I think we need to have the big prizes, but we need the carrots, the sticks, the tools, the rules, the gatekeeping, and we need character development. So like Frege, we step up to the plate with as people of integrity who would not compromise their integrity because it's part of our identity as a scientist.
Yeah, I mean, I was more referring to the hype of the big journals around they want to have a really singular message, but certainly what you're having more sticks would certainly prevent people from going into that. That's a great point.
Thank you all. I'm afraid I have the unpleasant task to call this exciting round to a close. Thank you again, Dr. Allison. We'll hear from you again tomorrow. And thank you all the other for participation.
Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Very welcome.